This is my review of the Sony a7r. Now, some of you know that I've been searching for a more portable, travel-friendly sized camera than something like my 5D Mark III that I use for shooting weddings. I love this camera, very versatile, very robust, but I don't always feel like carrying around such a heavy camera when I'm traveling. And I'm going to start doing some additional traveling on photo workshops and tours like that. So I wanted to test out the a7r, which offers an amazing 30 megapixels, almost medium format-like resolution and amazing dynamic range. And I can say that I have been blown away by the quality of these images. The resolution is awesome, but that dynamic range that it provides is just amazing. Now, a lot of times landscape photographers invest in very expensive filters to be able to control the amount of dynamic range in an image or in a scene before they take an image of it. Example is the Lee filters with the graduated neutral density so that you can slowly darken the sky and leave your landscape down below a brighter image. I'm not saying you can leave those behind, but they're less necessary when you have something like this, because in post-processing you can use that graduated filter that Lightroom provides to really bring out the detail in the sky or to brighten the landscape, because it is all hidden there in these raw files that provide a wonderful dynamic range. So we got it started right away with, here's this camera that is offering amazing medium format like quality in a very portable package. You say, wait a second, that looks like a very big lens you have on there. We'll get to my con list in a second, but I want to talk about some other things that I love about this camera. The fact that it is so small and light. Now, this is part of Sony's A7 series. They have the A7, now they have the a7r and the a7s. It actually works out that the a7r is the lightest. It's not a big difference between the other two models, but it is an amazingly light camera, and with some lenses, I'm thinking mostly of that Sony 35mm f2.8, you have almost a pocketable camera that blows away the image quality from anything else that you might be carrying around. Downside though is that's only one lens that offers that light a weight of package, and most of the other ones are heavier and expensive, and there's quite a limited selection of native lenses. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll come back and discuss that in a little bit more in a second. What else I loved about this camera is the general controls and layouts. I've been asked a little bit about how it feels in the hand, especially when you're using something like a Metabones adapter in the Canon. I have to say I've used this a lot on the tripod. That's how this camera feels. You set it up on a tripod, compose a nice landscape image, and so it doesn't really matter. But in the cases of when I've been carrying it around, I actually feel like it's quite nice. The lenses you're going to be using with it are usually larger and give you a nice grip to hold, and then you have this hand free back here to use these controls. The controls in general I found very similar to the Sony a6000, the a7 that I have reviewed, and I'll put a link to that review down below, and the a7s, which I'm also reviewing right now as well. So as you go through this review, keep that in mind that I've used all of these cameras, and if you have questions about any of the comparisons, I'll be saying some of that during this video, but just leave them down below. Nice control scheme back here, a good amount of customizability without being too button heavy. And one of the things that's really nice is you can use this camera in full manual mode, auto ISO on, and the exposure compensation dial, which is right here, works. A lot of people ask me, I'm shooting in manual mode on my DSLR and the auto exposure compensation, or the exposure compensation doesn't work. Why not? Well, when you're shooting in manual mode, you have taken control over all of the variables in the camera. And the camera can't change anything to compensate the exposure like you're asking, so it just ignores that when you're in manual on most cameras. Sony's smart enough to say, if you're shooting in auto ISO and you want some exposure compensation, we'll use that ISO to bump up or to lower based on what you've set on the exposure compensation dial. That's a nice, smart touch. It's got the tilty, flippy out screen right here, and I have to say that I've been quite happy with the screen. It's good, it's vibrant, and it doesn't necessarily require the use of the viewfinder very often. Even outside in bright sunlight, I was happy with this. It is not a touch-sensitive screen though, so you will be using the buttons, and the menu is a little tedious to navigate through, but it's not terrible, so good. Wi-Fi connectivity, again, very similar across all of these A series cameras, including the A6000. You've got one button push to send over to your phone. You have full remote capabilities in both manual mode and also to start and stop video, which is quite nice. One item that is on my pro list but is also going to show up on my con list is the fact that it doesn't come with a charger, a battery charger, but you can charge it in camera with a USB cord. I don't always like being limited to charging my batteries in the camera, because then if I've got multiple batteries and I want one to be charging while I'm using it, I don't have an option. The good news is you can pick up these small Sony chargers for just not a lot of money, a reasonable amount online, and also you're going to want a couple spare batteries, because as we talk about, battery life is not great. I mean, you make that sacrifice to carry around this much smaller, lighter camera than something like a 5D Mark III, and you are certainly sacrificing battery life. But one of the pros of having USB charging is that if you've got one of those battery backup, those little USB battery bits, I've recently reviewed one from Rav Power and been very happy with it, use it to keep my phone charged and lots of other things charged as well, then it works quite nicely to be able to charge your camera while you're out walking around and not using it. So simply, you've taken some pictures, you notice the battery's getting a little low, turn it off, plug it into that in your camera bag, and as you're walking around, it's going to be charging up. That battery will not charge it while you're using it, or I should say will not power it while you're using it. I've tried in multiple ways, configurations, and it just doesn't seem that that's possible right now. Maybe we could hope that there's a firmware upgrade that will allow that in the future, but right now it's not going to be a possibility. Those were all the good things. Amazing image quality, great dynamic range in this small, lightweight package with decent controls, excellent Wi-Fi. But as I mentioned, there are some drawbacks. Battery life is one of them. Another is that this camera is slow. And you know, I don't think this review is difficult to do because this is a niche camera. I see it for those landscape photographers or indoor portraits, or portrait photographers, or indoor still life or product photography where you want a lot of resolution and you don't need to fire off frames quickly and you don't care about focusing quickly, because this camera is slow to start up. It is slow to focus, especially if you're using adapters. We'll talk more about that in a second. And it is just slow in general to take frames of image. Your fastest is about 4 frames a second. Sounds like this. As soon as it gets focused, well, it's just manual focus. Ooh, it's not that slow. That was single shot. Let me turn it to speed priority continuous. Oh, and it crashed. That is another con that I'm going to bring up. And why don't I talk about it right now, why I do a battery pull. This camera has crashed on me more than any other camera. Other Sony a7r users, I would love to hear from you. I've been using the Sony a7S a bunch. I have not seen that crash nearly as much. Some of the freezes, I believe, are because I'm using a Metabones adapter. That is how I've mostly used this camera. But there have been a number of times where it has crashed on me, and a battery pull is the only thing that will get it back working again. And occasionally, some of those crashes, it would revert back to settings I had 15 minutes ago. I know because I was shooting indoors, had a very specific white balance. Minutes went by, I was back outside, shooting, everything was happy, and then it would crash, and suddenly the white balance was crazy blue. Let's see if we can get this better. Oh, it reverted back to single shot. That's speed priority. Now let's do it. There we go. So not terrible, but certainly not class leading. And that, coupled with the fact that you have slow to focus even when using native lenses, is an issue. So this is not a speed camera. If you want to capture any type of action, this is not the camera for you. If you want to capture landscapes in amazing detail, this may be the camera for you. So we've covered bugginess, we've covered the crashes, slow, processing and clearing the buffer I've seen is quite slow as well, and you just witnessed the fact that it crashed and then reverted back to a single shot. So all of those things are issues. You also heard the shutter there. It is quite a loud shutter. And there's even some discussion online. I think a lot has been made of this, more than should be, but the fact that the shutter shakes the camera, and at your slow shutter speeds you may see some blurring to that effect. I've been shooting at some of those slower shutter speeds, taking nice smooth water flowing pictures. I haven't seen that issue, so I think it's been blown out of proportion more, but it certainly is noisy. You're not going to be under the radar shooting with this camera. Compare it to the Sony a7s. I keep motioning down here. It's sitting down here right now with a nice ice. And this has a silent shutter mode that, if you're shooting wide open with the lens, is absolutely 100% silent. It's quite nice. But this is a very different camera, and you don't really want to compare these two. So those are most of the cons. One other con that I'm going to throw on here is that video quality is good. So how is that a con? Well, I was hoping for something that would allow me to use it in place. I could make a strong argument for spending my limited budget on this camera as a camera that I could shoot these videos with and also use as a nice travel photography camera. But video quality really is very similar to the 5D Mark III, and because there isn't a huge difference, it's hard for me to make that argument compared to something like the Panasonic GH4, which has amazing image quality at 1080 and offers 4K, of course. We'll talk more about that in my Sony a7s review. So it's fine, but it is not amazing with not amazing detail. Slightly more dynamic range, gives you a little bit more to play with in there, but overall, not too impressive. Well, the big con is the fact that if you want this camera, you have a very limited native lens selection. However, the full frame allows you to have a variety of adapters. Metabones makes several of them for all different kinds of lenses, including some older lenses. And of course, I've been using it mostly with Canon lenses because that's what I have a catalog of. That opens up a huge range of possibility. But for just native lenses, you don't have very many, and most of them, the fastest are f4. Again, landscape photographers, indoor product photographers, you don't care. You'll be happy with f4. But they do have some faster lenses coming, some actually just this month, and the rest of this year, Sony has been really working at saying, we're getting the lenses out. It's pretty amazing that they've got 3 bodies, A7, A7R, A7S. That's almost as many lenses as they have on the market for these bodies right now. You might notice that I have on the Sony a7S an adapter to fit one of Sony's own alpha mount lenses on the full frame E mount lenses. When you're looking for lenses for this camera, you're looking for FE. That's the full mount lenses. And those lenses can also be used on the earlier models as well. So, to sum up this review, which has been fairly brief, I'm going to show you some image samples and demonstrate that dynamic range in just a minute. And before I do that, though, let's talk. Well, I mean, I think you've got the idea from this review. If you're a landscape photographer, you want to travel lighter, because certainly the body is way lighter than something like a 5D Mark III. You can do that with this camera and get amazing image quality. Make sure you're bringing along a couple extra batteries. There's nothing else on the market in this price range that allows this quality of images. They just are fantastic. It's great. The downsides, though, that limited lens selection, unless you're using an adapter, and that battery life, and some of the other kind of Sony quirks. It also seems to yell at you a little bit more often, like, nope, you can't do that in this mode or that mode. Let's take a minute and look at some of the image samples that I think illustrate nicely the power of the Sony a7R, and a couple of them we're going to compare them against the 5D Mark III, again using that as a baseline. The first place to start off is a challenging scene. It is this kind of neon sign, neon and incandescent, because these are just standard old light bulbs, I think, plugged in, but we got some neon here at the Royal Diner, the Chelsea Royal Diner it's called. Here we are with the Sony a7R, and you can see those shot from a little bit further away. We're at ISO 1600, and we're going to compare it right now with a 5D Mark III. Here we got the two side by side, and now if we can zoom in here and sync them, and bring them both to similar sizes, but because of the resolution issue, there being more on the Sony a7, the Sony is larger and takes up more of the screen. You can see here at this level, not a huge difference between the two of them. Some in here in the a little bit, you lose bits of the neon. You can see that it's washed out, where it is still fairly well defined over here, ISO 1600. Really much more pleasing and softer colors that you can work with on the left, where we kind of have a harsher look over on the right. That's at ISO 1600. 5D Mark III, not so bad holding up against the Sony. Let's switch now to slightly higher ISO. We're now at ISO 4000. You can see we're having some of the same issues over here on the left-hand side on the Sony that we were on the earlier ISO of the 5D Mark III. But notice in here that these light bulbs are still individual, enough dynamic range to be able to display that really bright light bulb and then the darker areas in between. Over on the 5D Mark III, you can see that they all are really just blowing in together. They're all blown out into one big mess. Now what's interesting is we can go into the develop module of this. This is the Sony, and we can bring our highlights down, and right away those individual light bulbs pop out. You can see how clean we can make this. This is exaggerated. I wouldn't actually bring it down 40, but it's a good example of that. If we come over to the Canon now and we bring that highlights down the same amount, you can see that they also do a decent job, but not quite to the level that we see over on the Sony. And again, I have examples at higher ISOs, but it's just repeating the same thing. At ISO 8000, all of this is bleeding together on the Canon. You can never bring it out, pull it out, and the Sony is. Here is another example. Ignore the blurring in the middle. This is a client shot, and we don't release these to the public until, of course, the client has seen them. And this is just recently because I've only had the Sony a7r now for about 2 weeks. This is a more real-world scene where I think it really nicely illustrates the Sony's wonderful dynamic range. This is very similar to how my eyes saw the scene. We have this brilliant sun hitting the foliage in the background. We have what is deep shade areas here, but notice that it's not that dark. We have still plenty of detail in these shadowy scenes here, and we can, of course, even bring up our shadows, and it starts to feel almost like an HDR because we have so much range when we start to post-process the raw file in Lightroom. Let's move on and talk a little bit about in good light and even light. There's not a huge difference between these two. Looking at them at 1:1 or actually just normal ratio, they look quite similar. We can zoom in and see that we've got a lot of detail in the Canon file all the way down to this individual. I shot these handheld, so it's hard to be really scientific about it. But notice we have the greater reach. Because of the greater number of megapixels, we really can get in close. They were shot at the same level. But so, you know, the 5D Mark III holds up quite nicely, a lot of detail, but it's really those dynamic range images that showcase some differences. All right, in this next example, we've got the foliage reflected in the water here. And at 1:2, we don't see a whole lot of difference. The Canon might be a little bit warmer. These are straight out of the cameras with standard picture profiles applied. We zoom in actually to our 1:1, or let's be extreme and go 3:1, and let's synchronize those as well. You can see that we're closer on the Sony side over here, and a lot more detail is in this trunk and the leaves over here, and we've got a lot softer of a look when we're that far in. Just really illustrating how much the Sony gives you in megapixels and allows you to both crop in and retain detail while you're doing so. This next shot of the little flower at that wedding up on a line, completely backlit, again illustrates the nice dynamic range. Brightly lit by the sun, no chromatic aberration. That actually is nice. This is another thing, using these Canon, high-end Canon lenses on here really does shows how powerful those expensive lenses are. And deep in here, we've just got great detail, even when we zoom into the 3:1 level. And one more shot that shows you the nice detail. This is just a leaf in the backyard. This was using an extension tube with a 24-70 and the Metabones adapter. Quite a Frankenstein-looking combination, but allowed me to get this shot. It's not a spectacular shot, but again, without a macro lens, just a little extension tube, really got some nice detail in there. This has already been cropped slightly. So that was just a look at some of the images that I've been shooting out of the Sony a7r. I'll put a few more on the blog, along with a complete pro-con list, because there's a few of that I've left out of this video in an effort to keep it short, like the discussion about focus peaking, which works so nicely for manual focusing and is just built right into the Sony, and several other features. That will be right down below in just a few days after this video goes up. That's my review of the Sony a7R. Down below this is a link to the blog post where I'll post a few more image samples along with kind of a write-up of my pros and cons. Take a moment to look over that. If you've got any questions about the Sony a7R, the A7, which I've reviewed previously, the A7S review, which will be coming out soon, or of course the 5D Mark III, want to compare any of those, just leave a comment right down below. Thanks so much for watching, and if you haven't already,